And we've got folks from all over the place. We've got international visitors. Thank you all for joining us. I'm always impressed when I see folks from Australia joining us, especially at the 1 o'clock sessions. They're getting up at 5 in the morning, so appreciate having you here. If you haven't joined me before, my name is Joe Brady. I'm the Webinar Marketing Manager at the Mac Group, and I have the great job of preparing and presenting educational programs for our professional photographers. I am a passionate landscape photographer myself. I also own a portrait and wedding studio with my wife Diane. So I use all this stuff in my everyday work. I use color workflow in my everyday work. I make sure that the prints that I get look like they did on my screen, and all of that kind of is going to flow together today. Today's webinar is sponsored by Sekonic, and one of the things I'm going to talk about today is how and why I use a handheld light meter for my photography, particularly with HDR stuff. Again, it's going to be primarily landscape type work, and I don't rely on my camera's meter. Sekonic just launched a brand new website at sekonic.com, so I highly recommend you take a look at it. There's some great new stuff there, lots of educational materials, and a lot of great tools there for any photographer. So again, what we're here to talk about is HDR photography, HDR high dynamic range. It's been kind of the rage for a couple of years. It's gone through some ebbs and flows. There's people that really love what it can do, and there's people that that are saying, well, you look too grungy, too graphic for them. And what I've noticed is just in the latest releases of the most popular HDR softwares, there is a tendency back to more of a photorealistic look in their processing rather than the kind of grungy, super real kind of look. And it's been an interesting change. So what we're going to do with our HDR is we're going to be able to combine multiple images into a single image in order to get the exposure we need, because there's simply too much contrast or tonal range in the image for our camera to capture in one setting. For example here, in the past, generally what had to happen was, well, you had to pick either your sky was going to be exposed correctly or the foreground, the ground was going to be exposed correctly. With HDR photography, by capturing different exposures and combining them, we can create an image that has that detail carried through from the highlights to the shadows. So why do we need to do this? And even though we are starting to see cameras with HDR built in, I mean, my iPhone's got an HDR capability in it. Our cameras simply don't have enough tonal range abilities to capture the scenes in front of us compared to our eyes. Now, even though our eyes, in a static, if you're just going to capture one snapshot with your eye, actually has a tonal range pretty similar to what your cameras do. The difference is the eye is constantly opening and closing in the scene, kind of like it's doing its own HDR work all the time. And then the brain takes all those little snapshots and combines them together. So where our cameras have somewhere between 5 and 6.5 stops of tonal range, our eyes end up having something more on the range of 20, which is a much greater contrast ratio. So what that allows us to do is to see much more than our cameras can, which just have that single shot. So as an example, as you see right here, we have a shadow shot, we kind of have an average shot, but then the highlights start getting blown out, and then we're able to combine them into a single frame that allows us to capture all the tonal range. Now again, for those of you just joining us, please use the questions panel for your questions. I do see some of your questions coming through. If I don't answer your question right away, there's a real good chance it's coming up, so stay tuned. Tim has already asked about the difference between tone mapping and fusion, and yes, we're going to talk about that. So just a real quick review of f-stops. Now, just the amount of tonal range we're going to deal with, and exposure. Now, aperture f-stops, yes, we're used to dealing with 2, 8, 4, 5, 6, all these strange numbers, and other than to know that each full f-stop, which are the numbers you see here, allows half the light compared to the next smaller number. For example, f8 allows half the amount of light in that 5, 6 does. We're not going to deal with aperture changes in our HDR photography. We're going to deal with changing the shutter speed, because as you change the aperture, elements in the image are going to move because you're changing the amount of curvature of your lens that's being used. So we don't want to do that. We're going to change our shutter speed. Adjusting for Our shutter speeds is very easy. 1/250th of a second. It's kind of straightforward, is half as much light hitting the film plane, or the digital sensor in this case, as 125th of a second, and that's what we're going to do. There are some folks I have heard that actually adjust their ISO. Haven't tried that. Don't necessarily recommend it, because as you get up to higher ISOs, you're going to start to introduce different noise in each frame. So also the color can change, so you might not want to do that. Just shutter speeds are very easy. Now, one of the things that I see happening all the time is people shooting way too many frames for their HDR photography. You really, many cases, need much less than you might think. As I mentioned, your camera generally has a minimum of 5 stops, that's on the low end, up to about 6.5 stops of data. So what does that mean? Well, if we look here on this chart, if we say our middle exposure was at 125th, we know that our camera is going to safely capture at least 2 stops, probably more like 2.5, both up and down, from whatever that metered number is. So if our meter told us it was 1/25th, like right here, we know that that 125th of a second exposure, will cover all the way up to 1/500th and all the way down to 1/30th. If you start to capture a lot more frames, it's going to slow up the whole process. You're going to run out of room on your card, and it's going to take a lot longer to process the images. So let's explore this a little more. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you this 3 ways. Again, I know there's a whole varying range of capabilities here out in the audience today. So if I'm doing something real basic, bear with me, because I will be doing some advanced stuff as well. I'm going to first do an HDR demonstration just in Photoshop. No filters, none of the great HDR options, which what I'm going to use today are Photomatix Pro and Hdr Effects Pro. Kind of both the, well, at least in my opinion, the front runners and the most powerful and easy to use HDR softwares that are out there. Now, the other thing I'm going to talk about just before I go into Photoshop is that I mentioned I use a light meter for all of my photography. I rarely rely on the camera's meter for a couple of reasons. Well, the biggest reason is my camera is reading reflective light. It's averaging the scene and coming back with the proverbial 18% gray reading of that scene. Now, if the scene is a dark room like here, like the average here, I end up getting these really high blowouts in the highlights, and probably not capturing the shadow detail either. So what I will do is use a meter. Now, I do have 2 meters. I have a 758, which you see here, which is both a incident and spot meter, and a 358, which is an incident meter. And when I say incident, what these meters do is they measure the amount of light actually falling into the scene. They don't care what it is you're photographing. They don't care what color it is or how reflective it is. They just measure the amount of light available. I use this in my weddings as well. I'm sure you've all seen images with the bride's dress blown out and there's inky blackness in the back. By using a meter, you eliminate that. You're actually measuring the light falling on the subject. Now, the beauty of a spot meter, besides the one in your camera, is you can point it at a very specific area and get an exact reading. And particularly in HDR photography, it's very important that you capture the highlights and you don't have those blown out. Now, your cameras do have spot meters. The difference, however, is they're not as exacting as that in a handheld meter. Handheld meters is just a 1 degree reading, and I can get an exact reading out of that and figure out the exposures I need to get a full exposure from the scene. So again, I take, these were 3 shots, and this is a very high contrast scene, and still only needed 3 shots, and I ended up with a composited scene that looks like this. And for those of you that joined me in the past, this is from Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. It's a state park, great place for HDR, great textures. So again, why not rely on your camera's meter? Well, it's too easily fooled. It's fooled by the scene in front of you. You're going to get a different result depending on what it's pointing at. And you can see here the same exact place, yet there's three stops, basically 3 stops apart as you look from the middle reading to the high to the low, just because of where it's pointing. By having a meter, you're going to get a real perfect placement of that center point. And again, remember, any meter is going to measure the middle. Your camera is then going to be able to capture up and down from there. So why not just take lots of exposures? Why not go ahead? Well, we've all seen how big the files are getting on our cameras nowadays. My camera is anywhere from 23 to 30 megs for every shot. Every shot you take, it's going to start to fill up your card. You don't need to shoot 5 and 7 and 9 shots for HDR images. You'd be surprised how many times you only need to shoot 2. Excuse me. If you've been taking 5 or more, you're going to save up to 60% of your storage space. If I've heard people recommending taking exposures one stop apart. On a scene like the one we just saw, that could mean 9 exposures for a single scene, which is 270 megabytes of data for just one image. So you can imagine how fast your cards are going to get filled up. We're going to take a look at an image where the highlights are more than 5 stops brighter than the middle reading, and 3 exposures was still enough. We'll see that in just a second. Now, I mentioned I use 2 meters. If I'm doing some serious HDR work, I will bring a 758 with me. It does both incident, that reading the light falling on the scene, as well as the spot reading. It's got a lot of other high-end features that I'm not going to go into today, including actually calculating the exact sensitivity of your camera's sensor. But what this meter does is it gives me exactly how many exposures I need for HDR photography. And as I mentioned, one of the things about HDR photography is you got to be careful that you get an exposure that covers your highlights. For example, you've got a scene with a window. You can point that spot meter right at that bright piece of the window, or if you're outside at part of the cloud, and take a reading. Again, remember, these light meters are reading the middle. They're giving you the average for that point that you're shooting at. So if I, for example, point at a cloud and see that, let's say for argument's sake, I'm getting 1,000th of a second at f8 at ISO 100. Well, does that mean I need to do a shot at that reading? The answer to that is no. Because again, remember, your camera is going to capture 2 or more stops up and down from whatever the reading is in the camera. So in that case, if I had 1,000th of a second, I could actually come down 2 stops, which would be, well, 500th of a second would be 1 stop, 250th of a second would be 2 stops. That's all I need to do. All right, before I continue, my assistant Jen. Hey Jen, I know you can't talk to me, but I heard Phil just join us, so would you please mute him? I hear him coughing in the background. Yes, goodbye. Thank you, Phil. So anyway, it's really important. One of the reasons it's really important to get this brightness under control is because in a scene, when you're creating your images, that's a tendency where your eyes are going to go, and that's where the viewer's eyes are going to go. And you want to make sure you get that under control so you can direct your viewer to where you want in the scene. So for example, here's another shot from Eastern State Penitentiary. So here we have on the left, this was the average scene for the room. 100 ISO, 3 seconds at f8. Well, I did another one at 1.5, which actually turned out to be unnecessary because they're very close together. But then at 1/4 of a second, let's see what I was aiming at. See, here was the problem. We had this light coming in from the top, and that's not where I wanted to direct the viewer's eyes. So I have this 1/4 of a second, which was designed to capture this area just below the bright highlight, and then a 1/15th of a second to be able to bring the data into that highlight. So here's what ended up happening. Again, remember, each of these yellow bars is showing you the range that the camera is capturing at each of those exposures. So in this case, again, my average reading was f8 at 3 seconds. Now, the rest of the room was very dark, so there weren't any shadows that were really much darker than the average. Maybe a half a stop, maybe a stop. But again, remember, at 3 seconds, I captured 2 stops down and 2 stops up. So I'm really capturing from, in this case, from about 12 seconds to 3/4 of a second with that one exposure. So this entire range of exposure is being captured by that shot. And that was what was used for the average of the scene. Now, the highlight, this open window going up to the roof, was 1/60th of a second. Again, I did not need to shoot my exposure at 1/60th of a second, knowing that my camera was going to capture 2 stops up from whatever I set it at. So I set it 2 stops down. In this case, 2 stops down would be from 1/60th to 1/30th to 1/15th. So this 1/15th of a second exposure captured all the way up to a 60th, all the way down to a 1/4 of a second. Then I had one last exposure, this middle one, which again I spot metered off of this bright area just below the highlight, and that came F8 at a 1/4 of a second. And you can see from these 3 bars that they are completely overlapping. I have overlapping data for every shot. So that means that I'm going to, in these 3 exposures that I needed for my HDR shot, I'm covering from 12 seconds to 1/60th of a second as far as exposure goes. This extra one that I had taken, which was just very close to the first one, turned out to not be needed. So then what ended up happening was, again, here's the average exposure, but what happens is, because there's this bright highlight here, your eye is drawn to it away from the subject. So I got fanciful with it, combined the exposures, ran some filters through it to get something that was much more dramatic and interesting. Okay, well, we're not going to summarize yet. Let's get into Photoshop. And as I mentioned, I'm going to do one manually first, just so you can kind of understand the process. Let me hide the other stuff. Actually, let me go into Bridge. And I've got 2 images here. Now, if you're going to be doing any manual kind of HDR or any kind of HDR, if you're dealing with JPEGs, and I have JPEGs on RAW files here for you today. Again, we have a whole range of people here, so I want to make sure I cover everybody. If you've got JPEGs, a really good idea is to access them through Adobe Bridge, because by using Command R or Control R on a PC, it will open up my JPEGs in Adobe Camera Raw, and I can do some powerful adjustments here before I start to composite them. So I've got my highlight warning turned on, which is right up here, and we can see I've got some blowouts in the sky. Actually, let me go ahead and make this full screen for a second. All right, so I can bring the recovery slider up and see what that does for me. Oh, that gets rid of pretty much all of it. And let's see, I can add a little density to the blacks, and I want this to have a lot more saturation and pop. So I'm going to add vibrance and saturation to this. Yeah, that's looking better. And again, I'm concentrating on here because I can see the sky is just too light. Clarity is kind of will add a little bit of local contrast. And actually, this area is looking pretty good. So I'm going to leave that one and then go to the lower exposure, which had the sky. So again, I'm focused in on the sky here. I'm going to add a little bit of fill light to bring up the foreground. And I'm going to add some of this clarity again, which will add some structure to the sky. The sky might actually be a little dark. Let's see. No, I do like it the way it is. We'll leave it about right there. Okay. Now, one of the things, by the way, I'm not sure the technical reason why, but I've noticed most of the HDR programs recommend you don't sharpen ahead of time. So I'm not sure why. But they both the softwares we're going to use do recommend you don't do that. Now, this second exposure is actually getting pretty close. We probably could go in and lighten just the bottom of this up. But again, since it's got a lot of deep shadows in it, it's going to be a little noisier than this exposure, which has got better detail in the foreground. You might have noticed one other thing as I flip back and forth between these. They're moving. The other reason I wanted to show you this is because this was handheld. This was not using a tripod, which is a real bad idea when doing HDR. So what I wanted to do was show you kind of a worst case scenario. Okay, so I've got my 2 images. To keep things moving along, I'm just going to open them at 3 megapixels to keep the file small and fast. And I will now open these images. So let me just check questions here. Somebody asked about Topaz. Yes, I will use Topaz in this. I forgot about that earlier. And what other questions here? Does the high dynamic range image change the original colors of the image? It can or it cannot. That becomes a subjective choice, and you'll see in the softwares we're going to use where you can make that decision. All right, so I've got my 2 images here. So let me split them apart, because what I want to do is I'm going to take the brighter one and I'm going to overlay it right over top of the darker one. So I'm going to just get my move tool, hold down the shift key, drag it over to the other image, and then I can close this one. All right, so we can see here as I turn this on and off, oops, we got a problem. We've got images that are not lined up. So what do? Oh, there's a couple of ways around this. One way is to manually do it. Don't necessarily recommend this, but watch what happens. Take the lighter layer, change it from normal in the blending mode palette up here, from normal to difference. And what that shows you is really what are the differences between the two files. And I can then drag them so that they're as close as possible. Actually, that's not too shabby, but you can see where this border is, where they're still not quite matching up. And the reason is there's a slight bit of rotation also in the image. So behind the scenes, I'm going to hit Command T or Control T on a PC, and I'm going to just rotate this a little bit and see if I can get those white lines to disappear as much as possible. So we'll go ahead and apply that, and let's see where we are. All right, it's pretty good, but it's not perfect. Now, what I'm concerned about is the interface between the trees and the clouds, because that's where remember, we like the foreground exposure, and we like the sky from the darker one. So let me change this back to normal. And now if I turn them on and off, we can see the foreground's moving a little bit, but the trees aren't too bad. We don't care that the clouds are moving because we're going to get rid of those. And before some of you say, why don't you let Photoshop do the work? Yes, stay tuned. Now, one easy thing I could do right from here is choose my lighter one and go to Select, Color Range, Highlights, and click on OK. And that gets my sky plus some of this foreground. So I'm going to get my lasso tool, hold down the Alt or Option key, and drag around this bottom area to unselect it, to deselect it. So now I've got my sky selected. So what I can do now is create a mask for this layer. So I've got the sky selected. I create a mask, and if I hold down again Alt or Option and click on here, you can see that's what it created for me. Well, I don't want the mask, the black areas don't show through, the white areas do. What I really want is the inverse of this. I want to mask out the sky and let the foreground show through. So I just hit Command I or Control I on a PC, and that gives me a negative of that mask. I see I've got a little bit of clouds hanging out up here, so I'll just paint those in. By the way, guys, I know I'm kind of going quick. For those of you that aren't that experienced in Photoshop, yes, this is being recorded, so we'll let you know where the recording is, and you can review it at your own speed. All right, so let's see what we just did. We just kind of combined the darker sky with the lighter foreground. Getting pretty good, but let's take a look at this interface between the trees and the clouds. And as I zoom in real close, you can see we've got some black areas here, and that's where there was some movement, because when this image was taken, I moved. I wasn't planning on doing an HDR image of this. So how do you fix that? Well, one of the beauties of Photoshop is I can open the Masks panel, choose my mask for that layer, and I can just feather the mask. Look at that. See, they just disappeared, all those grungy things? It's a beautiful thing. And now we have a nice, clean interface between those two areas. Now I've got a little extra stuff. You can see there's space from below where it didn't match up. So I will just crop out. Again, if I'd used a tripod, I wouldn't have to do this. But I'll just crop that stuff out and hit Enter. And pretty good shape. Now, one last thing I like to do to my images before I do my final sharpening is I like to adjust the light kind of manually. And I do that with an adjustment layer here. So let's go ahead and create a blank layer, change it to overlay, and I'm going to get a brush at, let's try 20%. Oh, one quick Photoshop tip, by the way, guys. On a Mac, it's Control Option. On a PC, it is Control right click. If you hold them down and drag left and right, it makes your cursor bigger and smaller, your brush. If you go up and down, it changes the edge hardness of that brush. A great time saver. So keep that one in mind. So I'm going to, anywhere I paint with darker, you can see I get a little bit of darkness there. And anywhere I paint with white, gets a little bit lighter. And just this little bit of darkening and lightening will have a dramatic effect on your images. So what I'm doing is I'm enhancing the spots that are already light or already dark. And let's just take a look. Just that one little edit we just did there. Look, we went from there to there. Look at the dramatic difference. So there we have a manual HDR image. Pretty cool stuff. In fact, I'm going to save that one. Now, I typically save all my images as Photoshop files. Some of you like TIFFs. I like Photoshop. Now, before I leave this image, I'm going to show you. Now, I did that manual compositing. And I'm just going to reopen these and let Photoshop do it. There is a way to have Photoshop do this as well. So let me just open both of these again. And let's see, somebody asked about, can you do this all in Lightroom too? You can't composite in Lightroom. So the answer to that, unfortunately, is no. You can do a lot. All of the Adobe Camera Raw stuff that I did, yes, you can do that in Lightroom. But you can't overlay two images and mask out pieces. That's masking, and channels are what Photoshop does. All right, so again, I'll grab this and put it on top. And for those of you that said, why didn't you let Photoshop do the work? Well, Photoshop has something cool called auto align layers. In order to do that, though, I have to turn the background into a layer, which I do by double clicking on it. And we'll let it be layer 0. I then select both the layers and go to Edit, Auto Align Layers. I like reposition. I don't like any of the other ones. Click on OK. Photoshop tries to figure out where things go. And now if I turn this on and off, even though it tried to do a pretty good job on it, because I moved, they're actually slightly different images, so it's having a little perspective trouble. Let's take a look by turning this back to difference and see how it does. So it didn't do a whole lot better than we had done manually, because I ended up having to actually squish the image. So again, Command T. Let's see if I can get those to line up a little better. And that's, again, because our concern is we want this interface between the trees and the skies to be best. So sometimes this works really well. Sometimes it doesn't work a lot better than doing it by yourself. So remember, that's the one time I find the difference blending mode to be useful, is to line up two different layers. And when they line up, then you can, all that white stuff goes away. All right, so we've done it the hard way. We did it the way like, somebody asked me I metered these two images. No, I was out goofing around. I had no intentions of ever using these images for anything. But I shot a couple of different exposures of it. And as it turned out, it turned into a great example for HDR. Even though I ended up doing it manually, it ended up turning out to be a nice image. So let's get rid of this. And let's go into something a little more advanced. We're going to start completely manually. So I've got two images here. And the reason I went into Bridge to open these is, even though these are JPEGs, these were shot with my $149 point and shoot camera, I still want to open these in Adobe Camera Raw because I want to get them as good as possible first. By selecting them in Bridge and then hitting Command or Control R on a PC, Command R on a Mac, what that does is it opens my JPEGs in Adobe Camera Raw. Okay, let me just fit this to the screen. So here I've got my two images, and I've got my highlight warnings on here. Let me just make this a little smaller. So I want to try to adjust this image, each of the images, as best as I can before I actually open them. So my foreground looks okay. I've obviously got a lot of highlight blowout, so let's turn the recovery up. Probably not going to go all the way up, because even if we do, we still have areas of the image that are blown out that we did in order to get a correct exposure in the foreground. In fact, I'm even going to add a little bit of fill light to lighten the midtones and back off on the blacks. Now, this was a very cloudy day, and I want to add some pop to the image. So I'm going to increase the vibrance and saturation a lot. Now we're getting kind of that blue sky reflected in the water that I was after. Okay, so that one's pretty good. Now let's take a look at the shadow shot. Now, once again, I am after the sky in this one. So I'm going to bring it up a little bit, but I don't want to start to have any blowouts. I am going to add some fill light, and I'm going to once again increase the vibrance and the saturation. And let's increase the fill a little more, and the recovery a little more. I'm just trying to get rid of this little highlight up on the top there. And okay, that's gone. Alright, now we're looking pretty good. I could bring the fill light up again, but really what I'm after is I want the sky from this shot, and I want mostly the rest of the image from this shot. Now, this is a real difficult way of doing this because this was handheld. That's where the problem is. So let's go ahead and open both of these images. This was handheld and not even aligned. I didn't even try. And we'll see when we open these two images. So as these were opening, let me just take a couple of questions here. Someone asked, do I like that meter because it's the most expensive one? No, I just because it's got a spot meter that is very fine. The 758 is a 1 degree spot meter. So I will use that for reading my highlights and my shadows. For as far as the incident metering, I could use a 758 or a 358 or a 308. It doesn't really matter. Okay, so here's my two images. So let me just separate these out. And what I'm going to do is just drag the one over on top of the other. So I'm going to get the Move tool, hold down the Shift key, and drag it over. And whoops, you can see they don't line up because the exposures were shot that way. So let me close this one. So how do you do this? How do you line it up? Well, you can do it manually, or you can let Photoshop do the work, which is usually the best idea. Well, since these don't line up, I'm going to need some more real estate. So the first thing I'm going to do is increase the canvas. So I'm going to go to Image Canvas Size, and I'm going to make this 10 by 10 so I have some wiggle room. Okay. So now I've got both of my images and they're not lining up. Well, what I'm going to do in order to kind of line them up my own is I'm going to change the blending mode of the light layer from normal to difference. And when I do that, I get this ghostly image that lets me see where they're misaligned. So now I can just drag, and what I'm really concerned with is this horizon line. So I'm going to kind of get it in the ballpark, and I can see I have lots of difficulties here because there was movement. So again, I can use the V tool, try to line this thing up as best as possible, and I can see the tree doesn't line up, the mountain line doesn't line up because I probably moved a little bit. And again, this is worst case scenario. You should not be doing your HDR stuff like this. So I'm going to hit Command Control T and actually squish it in a little bit to just try to get a little bit more lining up there. That's better. All right, still not perfect though. Let me change this back to normal. And now we'll see, all right, we're getting better. They're getting pretty close to being lined up. So what I could do is get rid of the highlight area in the light image. And the easiest way to do that is just to select that image. And I'm going to go to Select, Color Range, Highlights, and hit OK. And that gives me the highlight area of that layer. Now I don't want to get rid of this stuff in the foreground. So let me bring up my lasso tool. I'm holding down Alt or Option to minus this out. And all right. So I got the sky. And I'm going to click on my mask tool here and add a mask. Now you can see here's the mask it gave me. I want the inverse of this. So I just hit Command I, and now, all right, we're getting close. See what we just did? We just kind of combined those, and we're starting to get close here. However, if I zoom in, you're going to see problems. You see these black areas around the trees. That's where things did not line up. And we've also got some stuff going on here in the mountains. So this is a problem. And again, this is one of the reasons that doing this stuff manually can be a real pain. So I'm going to click Alt on the mask, bring up a brush at 100%. I'm just going to clean off this top part here, just so it's not in our way. Okay. All right. So pretty good. We're getting close here. But again, as I mentioned, we've got a problem in here with this black areas in the tree. So what I can do is go to the mask window. Oh, I didn't select my mask, sorry. Select the mask first, go to the mask window, and I can start feathering the mask right here in Photoshop, and watch what happens as I increase this number. You'll see the black stuff start to disappear. Pretty simple. So that really did a pretty good job. So I'm just going to crop out the stuff that did not overlap, that we don't need. So I'm going to select about here and hit enter. And let's see this fill in the screen. Starting to look pretty good, actually. Although this is a lot of work. This is all manual. I'm just showing you this because to show you you can do a lot of this stuff without these tools. But now watch when we do this. And someone asked, shouldn't I be shooting in RAW? Isn't it better? Absolutely, it's better. This was shot with my $149 point and shoot camera, which doesn't give me a RAW option. So I want to show some examples that apply to everybody, that would work with anybody doing point and shoot stuff, all the way up to pros shooting high-end cameras. I want to make something available for everyone. All right, so I'm going to stack this. And this is another handy little item because I'm going to add one last little bit of extra stuff to this image. So I click on Merge Visible. And I was holding down Alt or Option when I did that. And what that does is it gives me a flattened image without actually flattening the image. Are you guys hearing another voice coming through, by the way? Yeah, hold on a second. Let me check. Okay, guys, apologize for that. We had something going on in our building where another voice was coming through from a conference room. Okay. Anyway, where were we? Yes. All right. Let me do that stacking thing one more time because this is real important. This does a lot of Photoshop applications. Again, hold down Alt or Option, and on the flyout menu, choose Merge Visible. And what that does is creates a flattened version of the image, but all of your layers are intact. The reason I did that is because there's one little technique, one last technique I'm going to show you for your HDR stuff that's going to add a lot of pop to your images. And what you do is you go to Channels, Command or Control click on the RGB icon on the actual thumbnail, and you get marching ants all over the place. And this is, excuse me, the 50% most luminous parts of the image. Hit Command J or Control J, and that copies that to a new layer. And if I turn off the other layers, you can see it's just kind of this ghostly thing. But watch what happens when I change the blending mode from normal to overlay. Look what it just did to the image. Look at that one little thing. Look at the pop and density it adds to the image. So not too shabby. Even though we had a $149 handheld JPEG image, we were able to go from there to there. And you could play with saturation and things from that on. But not too bad. However, that was a lot of work, wasn't it? Let's not save that. Let's do another way of doing this. I'm going to select those same images and just drag them, in this case, into Photomatix. Now, as I mentioned, let's go through a couple of the Photomatix options here. Yes, you're always going to align source images. Even if you're on a tripod, chances are there's going to be a little bit of movement, maybe just from the mirror bounce from the camera. So I would recommend using by matching features. Reduce ghosting artifacts. Now there's two choices here, semi-manual and automatic. I would recommend for landscape work sticking on automatic. Semi-manual is common when there's ghosting, meaning you've got a person in the frame or an animal that is moving, And what it allows you to do is to actually draw a circle around the people that are moving, and then it will use the exposure from one frame to do that. For landscape work, however, automatic is a good one. Reduce noise is actually more important for raw images than JPEGs in this software, and chromatic aberrations if you have a lot of real high contrast edges. So you now click on pre-process, where in the past in Photomatix you had to tell it you were either going to do a fusion or a tone mapping. Well, now it's all built into one. It's actually got a much nicer interface. If you guys have version 3 of Photomatix, it's a free upgrade to 4, and you highly recommend that you do that. Okay. Someone asked, why didn't I use the auto align layers thing in Photoshop? Sorry, I skipped that part. I'm going to do that in the next one. But yes, that is the automatic way of doing it rather than going through it manually. All right, so let me see a couple other questions. All right, so whatever that weird voice that was coming from is all better. That's gone. Okay. Somebody mentioned it. Is the audio okay for you guys now? Just want to make sure that you can hear me okay. Just let me know in the questions control panel. Okay, audio's back. Okay, so we're now here in Photomatix Pro. And again, these were two images that did not completely line up, so you have a lot of this extra stuff off to the side. And I had been playing with this earlier, so we have some of the grungy kind of look. But if you look through the choices now, many of them are just kind of much straighter. They're much more photographic. They've gotten away from some of the grungy stuff that used to be common. So for a real photographic look, the Fusion Adjusted is probably the best choice. And you can also come in, and again, it's a dark day, I want it to be lighter, so you can come in and add some saturation. You can do all kinds of boosts. I can adjust the white points and the black points. You can tell it where your midtones are. If I drag it down, that'll darken it. If I drag it up, that'll lighten it. And all of that work that we just had to do manually is handled automatically here. So it makes things a lot easier. But even though I can continue going on with this forever, I'm happy with it the way it is. I'm just going to click on Process, let it bring the image into Photoshop. And again, as I mentioned, even with my other softwares, none of them produce the exact image that I want. So it's handy to know just a couple of those tricks. Oh, somebody asked about what about HDR Pro in CS5? Good question. It used to be weak compared to the others. Now with the latest updates to Hdr Effects Pro and to Photomatix Pro, I find HDR Pro, the one that's built into Photoshop, absolutely unusable. So I don't recommend it. It just does not do a very good job. All right, I'm just going to save this image to the desktop so I can get to it quickly. And I have it set to automatically open it in CS5, which we will soon see it do. All right, so here's our image. I'm just going to crop out the other stuff. And, well, that was certainly a lot faster. Oop, I missed. Then doing it the first time, we let the software do all the work. It does a beautiful job of blending. You can see nice and clean all the stuff that we had done before. And again, the last thing I like to do, well, let me do a little saturation, because again, I wanted a little more oomph to this image. That's better. And that last thing, I'm just going to go ahead and flatten this one. I'm going to go to the channels. And somebody asked to see this again, so here it is one time. Click on the RGB icon with either the Command on a Mac or Control key on a PC held down. Command or Control J to copy that to a new layer. Go to my layers, and there's our layer again. There's our little ghostly layer. Change it from normal to overlay, and a lovely image. Now, when I did it here, because of the exposure settings that were used, it had a tendency to make the highlights go a little bit too bright, maybe almost a little bit of blown out. So I'll show you a real quick way to get rid of those. Go back to your base layer, go to Select, Color Range, Highlights again. I know I'm going through this fast, but I got a lot of stuff to show you guys, so bear with me. Okay, so there's all my highlights chosen. Go back to the adjustment that the overlay layer we just created. with the marching ants running around and click on the mask. And again, if I look at the mask, you can see what it selected. It actually selected the highlights. I want just the opposite. I want to mask out the highlights. So I inverse this mask just by hitting Command or Control I, and I get a negative of it. And now you can see we've added that little bit of pop, basically to just to the midtones, and it does a really nice job. That's Photomatix. And we'll do a couple more Photomatix things as well, but really simple to use, as you see. Lots of options. Photomatix Pro used to be kind of difficult to use. It used to be very intuitive, a lot of messing around with sliders. Now it actually looks very close to the way HDR Effects Pro from Nick looks, where they've given you all these presets, and it's a much friendlier program than it used to be. So I had been losing interest in it, but I am now back in their corner. Now it's once again a great piece of software. They've really kept up. All right, let's close this one, and we'll get rid of that as well. So okay, first we're going to use Photomatix Pro. Now, Photomatix Pro recently went through a big upgrade. Highly recommend it. I had honestly started to lose interest in Photomatix because it required a lot of manipulation, a lot of trial and error to get exactly the way you wanted it. The recent upgrade is a huge upgrade. If you have version 3, the upgrade to version 4 is free. And you can simply take your images and drag them right to, oh, I thought I had it open. Never mind, I guess I got to open it first. Yep, I don't have it open. So let me open up Photomatix. Let's see, well, this is a couple of questions. John asked, good question, doesn't Photoshop 5 have an HDR function? Photoshop 4 did as well. But it's, well, I'll be nice. It doesn't work that great. I'll just say that. Photoshop 4's was actually really awful. Photoshop's 5 HDR Pro is okay. It kind of works like Photomatix did 2 versions ago, but both Photomatix Pro and Nick's HDR Effects Pro have surpassed the one built into Photoshop by light years, to the point where it's made it unusable. So now, as far as these images go, exposure-wise, well, actually, let's take a look. Each of these images are 2 stops apart. So here's my average reading. This is 2 stops open, 2 stops down. So let's take these 3 images, and we're going to drag these into Photomatix Pro, and I can just drag them. Now, I don't know why you'd want to open the files only. Of course, I want to merge them. It says here's the images. And this was actually an old train car outside of Woodstock, New York that I happened to stumble upon. Now, we always want to align the source images. I highly recommend you use matching features, not this horizontal vertical thing. Ghosting, 2 times you use ghosting. You want to reduce ghosting. One, if there's people in the scene and then they move, then you want to use this semi-manual ghosting. If it's windy and there's trees, then you'd want to use automatic. In this case, it was a still day, nothing going on outside. I'm inside this old train, so no reason to do ghosting. Reduced noise is recommended that you do it on the source images if you're doing RAW. They actually don't recommend that you do it on JPEGs, so you can try that and see if you see a difference. Chromatic aberrations will happen if you have really extreme contrast edges. I didn't notice any in this image, so I will not bother, but again, that's something you can try. So in the past, you had to choose whether you were going to use tone mapping or fusion. Now it does this thing called pre-process, where it presents you with kind of a pre-composited file, and then you can choose from there if you want to do tone mapping or fusion. Now, you can use raw files, you can use JPEGs, you can use TIFFs, you can use DNGs. Did I leave anything out? You can use pretty much anything when you're dealing with this. Okay, so in the past, you used to see what was that prior image. Now we have tone mapping and fusion. So what are the differences? Fusion is more for those of you that are interested in a real straight photographic result. Let's just click on that. In fact, you can see that there there are adjustments based on different styles here for you. So if I click on Fusion Adjusted, you can see it's a very straight, kind of how your eye saw it. No effects, no enhancements. It's really very straightforward. And there you kind of get a preview as to kind of how the scene looked to the eye. If you want to take it a little bit further, when I happened upon this scene, there was graffiti all over the place, lots of peeling walls and paint, and I thought an effect something like this might be more interesting, or maybe something like this with some of the grunge turned up. So again, you have a choice here of these presets, or you can come up to tone mapping, which is what you might use if you're going for more of the grunge look, and go to Detail Enhancer, and you can see what just happened. I can increase, actually I want to increase this contrast, sorry. You have these smoothings. The lower the smoothing, the grungier it gets, as you can see as you choose these modes. And as I come down to the bottom, there's this micro smoothing, which will flatten the image or turn it off completely for the most grungy look. This is kind of what I envisioned when I saw this particular scene, so that's kind of where I want to go. But you can also see here that it's really compressed the image. We've got highlight detail, we've got, let's zoom in a bit. You can see here as we move around, my loop isn't lining up, that we've got great detail in these highlight spots. In fact, this preview screen isn't completely accurate. You kind of have to look at it with the loop, and then you'll actually get to see what's going on in the image. So I really like how that's turned out. That's kind of what I was after for this scene. And again, if you decide you want more of a straight photographic look, you can go to Fusion. You can also save these. If I like these settings, I'll call it Crunchy 2. And that will always be available for you. So if I go to change something, if I go back to Fusion, or let's say I want to see what it looks like as a black and white image, I can click on black and white and try that as well. If I decide, no, I really don't like that, I can go back to the one I had just saved, and we're right back where we were. Then you just click on Process. And again, one of the other things I like about Photomatix Pro is it is very fast. And you can see that the image ends up looking a little different here than what you saw in your preview. So then you just save this. I'll just save it on my desktop so we can find it easily, because I'm going to open up in Photoshop and do something else. All right. So as a variation of this, let's actually close this file. Let's take the same image and process it in HDR Effects Pro. So it works a little differently. It's in Photoshop as a plugin, where Photomatix operates best outside as its own application, and merge to HDR Effects Pro. So I'm going to select my images and go to my train car, and here are my 3 shots, and I click on Open. Now again, you see they have the same ghost reduction and the ghost strength. And click on OK and let it start to do its processing. Now, HDR Effects Pro gives you a lot more options when you actually go to process the files, so it does take a little bit longer initially. So while that's cooking, let me just check a couple of your questions. Again, somebody asked, should you use RAW file in Photomatix? It's probably going to give you the best result. However, JPEGs also work really well, so try it. And generally on any scene like this, I will always go at least 2 stops difference. I will take a meter reading of a real highlight if I suspect there might be something that's going to cause me trouble. In a scene like the train car, not necessary because I just had the outside and inside. But if I'm outside and I've got deep shadows, let's say particularly if I'm out in canyons and I've got a deep shadow in the canyon, then I've got a bright sky, I will take a meter reading on a white cloud because I want to know what my brightest exposure has to be. So again, if I have 2,000th of a second at f8, then I will make sure to take a shot at 1/500th of a second. Again, 2 stops below that, but I know my camera is going to capture 2.5 stops above. All right, so it's done kind of the fusion thing, where it's now ready to be tone mapped. But again, HDR Effects Pro is going to do that for us. So now it's calculating out all the possibilities from this image, and it's going to give us an interface very similar to what we just saw. Someone asked if I personally shoot RAW or JPEG. I only shoot RAW. I am both a Lightroom and Photoshop user, and especially for landscape work, there's no reason at this point to ever shoot JPEGs. The only time I do shoot JPEGs is if I'm using my little $149 point and shoot camera to take snapshots, because that's all it does. Other than that, I always shoot RAW. Alright, so again, kind of a similar interface. We've got categories up here. If I want just to see just the realistic options, I can choose as I scroll down here. Let's say I want to see what this realistic strong looks like. Pretty cool. Similar effect, but slightly different. And after I get kind of a base that I like, now I can see as I look at this little highlight spot, it's a little bright for my liking. So I could bring that down. And over here on the slider, I've got these global adjustments, and they'll affect the entire image. Well, I kind of like the exposure of the rest of the scene. I just have this one highlight here. So what I can do is bring down just the whites a little bit and take a look in. Still a little, that's getting better, as you can see in the histogram loop in the lower right hand corner. I'm going to fix that a little bit more. Structure is one of the great things in HDR effects, as in most of the Nik filters. It's kind of a localized contrast that adds that kind of little grunge. If you're doing mountains and landscapes, it brings out fine details. On things like this, it accentuates textures. I do want some more saturation in this. The preset had desaturated. I want it a little warmer. Okay, so we're pretty close here. Now let's take a look at the thing that really separates out the Nik stuff, and that's the ability to add control points. Now we've had all these global adjustments, and they affect the entire image. By using a control point, I can zoom in on a certain spot, in this case this little white highlight on the back wall, and first thing I have is kind of the circle of influence. How much of the area do I want to affect? Also, it's cued in on the tone and the brightness of the image, of the section you chose, so it's only going to affect that area. So if let's zoom in on this a little bit more. Okay. So there's my area. As I bring the exposure down, it's only going to affect, as it redraws, the area that I'm on. See what it just did there? So let's bring it back. There's 0. That's where it was. I just brought that down. I'll go a full stop and see what that looks like. Let it redraw, and that was actually too much. I'll go a half a stop. I can also adjust the contrast and the saturation, and I can click on this little triangle, and basically I get all of the same options that we had on the global adjustments locally. So if I want to decrease the contrast and maybe add a little more structure into that, I can do that just to that one little spot. So let's fit back to the full screen. Okay, so we have that one little control point there. This outside here, as I look out through the windows, you can see through the loop, it's still a little bit hot out here, a little bit overly bright. So what I'm going to do is add a control point there. So I'm going to go right in the field here, click on that, and I'll let it go a little bigger. I'm going to bring down the exposure a little bit. I'm also going to, I think I'll increase the contrast, and I'm going to bring down the saturation because it's a little bit too much for out there. Alright, so maybe even a little less exposure. Let's see what happens. That's looking better. That's more what I was after. Now, if I like what I've seen, maybe I overdid it with the exposure. Bring it back up a little. We'll do 4/10. Okay, that looks good. Now, if I like what I've done, I don't have to, I could expand it to the entire area because, again, it's only going to affect the stuff that's the green. If I did not have a contiguous space to work with like here, I could take this, just hit Command or Control D, that makes a copy of this setting, and I can just apply it to other areas that are similar in function. And there we go. The other nice thing is I can kind of tone this image a little bit. if I want to come in here and darken this left wall a bit, I can give myself a little bigger area, and I'm going to bring down the exposure and add some saturation here. So I'm going to bring those blues out on the wall. And I'm going to Command D that to duplicate it again and do the same thing up here on the ceiling. So I was able to shade the image. So you see you have the ultimate of control by using this particular way of doing your HDR work. So let's go ahead and let that process, and that will open up that in Photoshop. And as that's doing, let me see a couple questions. So I always get this question, do you like Photomatix Pro or HDR Effects Pro better? Yolanda asks. Boy, I like them both. Is that the cheap way out? Where I will go. I really like the way Photomatix processes if I'm really after a straight photographic as my eye saw it result. The fusion version, the way that Photomatix does that fusion really works well for me. However, I like them both. So yeah. Another question is, somebody asked when I'm shooting RAW, for HDR, do I always use prime lenses? Actually, I do not. I always shoot on a tripod. My lenses are, I do use good lenses. My lenses are all 2/8. I do not find myself using primes for that because a lot of times when I'm shooting HDR, especially when I stumble across a spot like this, I have no idea what focal length I'm going to use. But yes, a fixed focal length lens is not a bad idea. Let's see. Okay. So somebody asked, after you do all this processing, be it in Photomatix or HDR Effects Pro, can you then do the rest of the stuff that I did in Lightroom? Absolutely. These things work in Lightroom as well. What I may do, again, from here, is might want to add some layers. Maybe I want to go in and do some adjustments like I did before in the other images. I might do that same luminosity trick. So we've seen HDR Effects Pro, we've seen Photomatix. Let's just close this. Now, there are some people that are that recommend shooting one stop apart, and I don't recommend that because, as we've seen, your images, your camera is capturing at least 2 stops up and down every time you take a shot. So if you're shooting one stop, you're basically recreating 75 to 80% of your data in every shot. 2 stops apart is capturing all the tonal range you need. So I really find it a waste. I've never seen a time when you actually needed to actually have those 1 stop apart images. In fact, sometimes I will go even push it and go to 3 stops apart. Now, someone asked, does Photomatix work with Photoshop Elements? And the answer to that is yes, because Photomatix is there's actually 2 flavors of it when you get it. There's actually now a plug-in export from Lightroom, and there's one in Photoshop, but there's also the standalone application, which is what I just showed you. It works independently of everything else. You just create your Fusion image, and it then saves it as a TIFF file, which you can then open up in any of your image editing programs. Okay, so this image is cooking. So HDR Effects Pro is now taking the 3 images, it's loaded them all in, and now it's going to open up the plugin and start processing them. Let's see. This is Photomatix Pro we're talking about. Okay. So someone asked how I got the Photomatix in the last demo again. Right as soon as we're done with this, I'll show you. But as you can see, I have it on my dock here. It's just an application. It's right here, and it's a standalone app, and I can just literally drag images to it, and it will automatically open them up. So again, here we are in Nik. Now, Nik takes what we did in Photomatix, and then it adds a lot of cool features that give you a lot more power. You pay more for it, it's about twice the price, but if you're really doing a lot of HDR, you might want to do it as a consideration. So you can click through the different choices. Oh, I kind of like that one, although it's a little dark. But actually, that's a pretty good starting point. I can vibrant details and colors. Let's see what that looks like. That's a little too much. Let's go subdued contrast. I like that. Now, after you've gotten your base chosen over here, and you can see there's all these presets. I'm looking at them all. You can look at them, view realistic or artistic, etc. I've got one that I like as a base. Then I'll come over here and you can see there's global adjustments. So if I like the exposure, I can bring it up a little bit and see what that does. No, it actually was good where it was. I'm going to leave it there. Now you might think this foreground's a little dark, but stay tuned. Contrast is straightforward, as is saturation. Structure is one of the real and powerful parts of Nik. And what structure is kind of a localized contrast adjustment, and it's what really gives you the fine details. You can see, as in the bottom right, as I go through the image, you can see the histogram showing you 100%. What structure does is increase that localized contrast edges. And if you bring it up real far, then you start getting that kind of crunchy look that looks kind of crazy. See, that's way overdone. That's kind of the original, how people were doing HDR stuff. More Topaz looking. You can see as I bring this up, I can adjust the blacks up and down. And again, where it was pretty good. And if I think the whites are a little too hot, I can bring those down as well. Nope, they were actually good as well. And warmth is just what it says. It actually adds a little bit of warmth to the image. Now, where Nik separates itself out from everybody else is the selective adjustments with these control points. So if I decide I like the top of the image, but the bottom's a little too dark, say this canyon down in here, I can click on here, add a control point. Now this circle is the area of influence of these changes I make, and it is tied to the tone and color of where I select. So if I overlap these green bushes, for example, and I'm working on this brown stone, it's not going to have any effect. But I can adjust the exposure right here. And see, as I bring it up, it's just working on there. I can adjust the contrast. I can add more saturation. If I click down, I get all of the same choices that you see over here in the global adjustments. They're just abbreviated. So I can increase the structure down in there. And if I decide I like that and I want to add the same exact changes elsewhere, I can hit Command or Control D, which will duplicate it, and just drag it over to the other area. Do that one more time, and I'll come over in here. And that one was a little too much, so I'm going to fade that one a little bit. And conversely, if I decide that this area here is a little bit too hot, I can click on there and bring the exposure down a smidge. So this is what Nik HDR Effects brings to you. It gives you not only all the HDR compositing, but it takes it one step further by giving you all these control points and all of these global adjustments that are very easy to understand. And by the way, if you guys are interested in this when we're done, actually I'll give you the code at the end. We'll also follow up in an email with the recording. I'll give you a discount code if you wanted, if you were interested in Nik softwares. Okay, so I'm happy with that. So I'm going to hit OK and let Nik process it. So it's going to take this image and then it will just open it up in Photoshop for me. Let's see, a couple questions why this is cooking. Someone asked about is there a way to sharpen before merging? You could do that if you had JPEGs and you sharpened it ahead of time. Generally not recommended that you do that with HDR stuff. You should do that after the fact. And I'll show you my favorite way of sharpening. Alright, so let me just fill the screen with this a little bit better. And all of these softwares, by the way, don't look very good when you're backed off. You can see when I move in close that the image actually is fairly sharp. So I have the image here. One other thing I want to do, I like to even paint with light a little more to give myself some control. So the way I do that is to create a new layer, which is right here. I'm going to change the blending mode to overlay, and I'm going to fill it with 50% gray just so that you can see a little better what it is I'm doing here. Now notice with overlay, even though it's filled to 50% gray, nothing happens. The beauty of an overlay layer this way is everywhere I paint with black, anything darker than 50% gray will darken the image, anything lighter will lighten the image. So if I bring up a brush, and what I'm after is I want to lighten in down here, so I'm going to put white in the foreground, and I'm going to type in 2 to give myself a 20% opacity. One other painting tip, if you haven't watched my Photoshop classes before, if you hold down Control Option on a Mac or Control right click on a PC and drag left and right, that makes the brush bigger and smaller. And if you drag up and down, that makes the edge harder. One of the greatest time savings shortcuts in Photoshop. Okay, so we're at 20% white. I've got my gray overlay layer. And as I paint with that, you can see it just starts lightening up the image, and I can just do it selectively where I want. If I hit X to put black in the foreground and come over to this light area, I can then darken that up. And I can decide, maybe in this foreground I want this stone a little bit darker and make it a little smaller. And maybe I do want the bushes to be a little lighter. And just this little bit of adjustment here can have an enormous effect on your image. So I'm going to lighten up these shadows in here a little, and this part of the canyon. Alright, so I'll be done with it for now. You could go on forever playing with this kind of stuff. But let me change this layer back to normal so you can see. Here's what we just did. Just added a little bit of light and darken spots. I'll go back to overlay, and just that little bit of changes we just did, look what happens to the image. Look at the change in focus of the image. Now you're more directed to the foreground by having that lighter. Really handy when you're doing HDR stuff. Alright, so let's close that and move on to another one. So these are Canon RAW files, and for Photomatix I'm just going to drag them. We want to merge them. Here's the images I just put in. I know there's no ghosting in this image, so I'm not going to bother. And just click on pre-process. One thing I do like about Photomatix is it's really fast. So I will say that much. And somebody said just don't do it manually again. Okay. Hey, I had to show it manually just to let people know that there are certain things you can do manually if you don't happen to have this software. Somebody asked, will this work on a 32-bit laptop? The answer is yes. I'm actually doing all this stuff for you guys on my laptop. Let's see. Yeah, out of all you that answered me, somebody asked to see it in Photoshop's HDR Pro, and the answer to that is no. It really is. It's become a very, compared to Nick and Photomatix, if you're doing a lot of HDR work, Photoshop's HDR merging is just not kept up. So I'm not going to recommend you do it if you're serious about it. Okay, so again, here's our stuff in Nick, or in Photomatix rather. I happen to like this painterly one. I went into this place thinking kind of more grungy, and I might bring up the micro contrast here to add a little bit more smoothness. And there's also these light modes. As I bring these up and down, that'll make it a little less grungy. And actually that's pretty good. So you saw how fast that was. Maybe I'll go in and add a little bit of saturation into the shadows. And I might turn off the micro smoothing here because I actually want a little more of that grunge. By the way, if any of you guys have ever seen Rick Samans' HDR book, you might notice that the cover looks very similar to this, except there's a young lady standing with her back to you. Rick and I were out shooting together one day, and we came across this old abandoned building and went and shot in here. And he loved it so much that he came back the next day with a model, and that's the image that ended on the cover of his book. So if you're looking for a good book on HDR stuff, take a look at Rick's book. Okay, so here's our tone mapped image. A little bit more of a painterly kind of grungy look. And I would do the same kind of things in Photoshop. Oh, I did want to show you a sharpening thing, so I am going to save this. I'll just put it on the desktop again. I'm not going to open it yet. Now let's do the same thing using Hdr Effects Pro. So I have to do that from within Photoshop. And File, Automate, Hdr Effects Pro. Select my images. And, whoops, wrong folder. Thank you guys for the questions, by the way. I'm trying to keep up with you guys. All right, so here's my 3 images. Let me just check. let's see. Somebody asked if we put the boots there. Yes, they were sitting in the room, but we did. There was a very cool. It's actually an entire little development that somehow fell through the cracks, and there's a whole bunch of houses in there. But here we go. Okay, so once again, we've got our interface on the left with all our different choices. You can go from a very realistic with strong contrast to more of a grungy. Fine structures is what kind of is associated with that that grungy look, or something like this. I really like one thing that Nick does really well is I love what it does with the black and whites. As you can see here, it makes really cool black and whites, HDR black and whites as well. As well, there's some along with some kind of very painterly looking, kind of strange effects as you see here. So once again, I'm going to start with something kind of straightforward. I'm going to go slightly surreal though. Now, let's go landscape. And choose, we'll choose one of the straight ones. Yeah, that's too straight. Let's go a little more exciting. Add a little bit more. All right, so again, I'm going to increase the structure over here to add that kind of little bit more grungy look. I'm going to increase the saturation a bunch. And I'm going to increase the contrast a little bit too. Now again, what I really like about this software is I can add control points. So if I feel that this foliage outside the door is too bright, I can give myself a circle big enough for it and bring down the exposure. Maybe bring down the saturation too. And the other thing I can do is I can start to tone the image. So if I decide this wall over here should not be a focus, I want you to look more, kind of be guided a little bit more towards the chair. So I'm just going to bring down the exposure in that area, and you can see it does a nice gradual fade off, which is again handy for shaping your image. Same thing, I'm going to put something on the chair here, and I'm going to increase the exposure just around the chair a little bit, so that kind of directs your eye a little more towards the image. So again, that's what I really like about the Nick controls. It takes you a couple of steps further. And if I scroll down here, you can see there's all kinds of vignettes available. I can put different frames around it. I can adjust the curves. So there is some other cool stuff there. And I click on OK, and it processes the image. And the last thing I would do is to add my sharpening. And my favorite sharpening for this kind of work is Smart Sharpen in Photoshop. Now once again, I might do that same trick that I showed you guys before. I will go to the channels, Command or Control click on the RGB icon, Command J to put that on a new layer, and then change it from normal to overlay. Yeah, I like what that did. It adds a little more pop to the image. And I might also decide to add a little bit of curve and bring up the midtones a little bit. Something maybe like that. Oh, what the heck, you guys got me on a roll. You're asking me this stuff. So one last thing. I'll create a blank layer, change it to overlay, and once again I can paint light and dark. So if I get myself a nice big brush, put black in the foreground, I'm still at 20%, and I can really shape the light by focusing in on the chair. I'll even darken this foreground a little more. So you can see how just doing that little bit that I just did there completely changes the focus in the image. Now if you do something like that and it turns out to be too strong, you can just adjust the opacity of the layer a bit. Or if you want a little bit less contrast effect, change it from overlay to soft light, which is a little more subtle change. I think overlay works good in this one. So again, that's Nick Hdr Effects Pro. Very cool program. And I'll save that. What the heck. I like the way that turned out. Yes, we know. And I'm going to bring up one more example. And as we do that, let's see. Do I want to do sunrise or... Oh, let's do one of the Eastern State Penitentiary ones. Okay, so I'm going to ask you guys. We'll see what your favorite is. Oh yes, thank you, Vern. I will do a sharpening. Oh, and I want to show you a Topaz thing as well. So before I get that, I'm going to ask you guys. You want to see another one in Photomatix or HDR Effects Pro? Let's see. The votes come in, and okay. Well, I'm getting okay. It's split down the middle. Okay, guys, you convinced me. I'll just do them both real quick. Okay. So I'm going to take these three and dump them into Photomatix first. And we'll just go ahead and let these process and let them do their thing. Now, this was a very extreme scene again. And again, this is why I use a light meter, because it was very important that I was able to capture data in this skylight in this building, because I needed to have data in there so that when I finally brought the image down, it wasn't going to be the absolute focus of the image. It was real important that I had that. That's why I need to use a meter. Also, very dark hallway otherwise, so my average exposure, if I hadn't used a meter, would have actually been much too bright. By using a meter, here was my middle exposure. Now, if I had let the camera do it, this would have ended up being much lighter. So by having the meter, I'm able to get my incident average reading from my center. I'll then do a shadow shot to get my deepest shadows, and then that highlight shot to be able to get the glass. And you can see how much detail there is in the glass up here. So much better. Now this is a really kind of freaky place. Again, this is Eastern State Penitentiary. And wow, I actually like kind of right where it left off. I think I might use this. Let's see. I might bring the black point up a bit. Yeah, what do you think? Let's darken that a little. Okay, that looks cool. So I'm gonna run with that one. And let's see what other. Another good question. Dean asks, do I use Adobe RGB or Srgb for my color space? When you're dealing with RAW, there really is no color space yet. Not until the image has been processed. Typically, I'm working in Adobe RGB. Srgb I use if the image is destined for my lab. But most of the times I work in Adobe RGB. If it's going to have a lot of serious editing, and I'm going to go out to an inkjet printer on a glossy stock, I may go Pro Photo RGB. So it's a simple question with a complicated answer. So if you guys will stay tuned, check out the X-Rite Photo website. That's where the color management webinars get posted. I will be doing one on color workflow where I'll go over the details of all the different color spaces and rendering intents and stuff like that. Okay, so let me save this image. I'll save this one on the desktop again. And actually, I'll just as you can see here, I can open it right in Photoshop. So let me save that. And it will open it directly in Photoshop for us. And then I'm going to take the same three shots, and I'm going to quit Photomatix now. I'm going to take the same three and go to Automate and do them in HDR Effects Pro. So let me select my images, and here they are. If you're ever in Philadelphia, very cool place to go visit. Eastern State Penitentiary. All right, so again, while that's cooking, now again, somebody asked, do I bracket manually since I meter handheld? Yeah, the answer to that is yes. I will typically bracket manually. I will just set my shutter speeds. If I do my center reading and I find, let's say I need 60th of a second, I will go up 2 stops from there, which will be 2/50th of a second, and down 2 stops, which would be a 15th of a second. That's on the average. Now, sometimes I'll meter, and what will often happen is my highlight will be much brighter. So I might do a 60th of a second, and then do, remember, a 250th of a second exposure is going to cover up another 2 stops. So it'll cover all the way up to a 1,000th of a second. But if my highlight is all the way up to a 2,000, then I will shoot one at 1,000th. I will add a third. Shoot one at 1,000th of a second and one at 250. That way I've got my whole range covered. Typically in a scene like that, though, you don't end up needing to shoot another shadow shot. All right, so here we have realistic. Looks a little bit hot for me. Here's one with the gradients brought down, so that's giving us more detail. Again, I see this as kind of a grungy kind of place. So let's see the fine structure setting. Yeah, that's kind of more what I see. And I still want the exposure brought down. I don't want the highlights in that window blown out. But here's the beauty of the control points, because I can put one in and increase the exposure locally should I choose. And I'll leave that one that way, and I'll just hit OK. Oh, really good question. Somebody asked, Patricia asked, in doing HDR, how important is the monitor? Wow, shame on me for not even bringing that up. It's really important. I should have started with this. When you're working in Photoshop or Lightroom, all of these programs, for you to do any editing, are assuming that your monitor has been calibrated and profiled. If your monitor is too bright, then your HDR work is going to end up wrong. You're going to end up getting prints that are much darker. So you do have to be careful with that. Before you do anything, make sure you monitor and profile, or calibrate and profile your monitor. Again, a subject for another day. All right, so we've got two examples here. One done with HDR Effects Pro, this one. The other one done with Photomatix. I chose kind of two different styles. This one was very realistic from HDR Effects Pro. For Photomatix, I chose a more grungy look. For this scene, again, it depends what you're after. Are you looking to document the scene, or are you looking to create something that's a little more kind of, creepy? Actually, for this particular scene, I think I like the creepy one. So let's go ahead and look at this. And a couple of folks asked about sharpening. I have a couple of ideas what I'm going to do with this. So let's just do a couple of effects real quick. I'm going to add a bunch of saturation because I want it to show up on the front walls. Yeah, there we go. And then I'm going to create that overlay layer again. A blank layer is overlay. And I'm going to bring up black, give myself a big brush. I'm going to paint it 20% because, whoops, I got white in the foreground. Let's undo that. I want to darken these walls. I want to lead you down this hallway. And in fact, I even want to darken down the window a little bit. And lighten up this distance right over in here, whatever's going on down there. Now we're starting to get something interesting looking here. And I have a little more extra on the sidewalls than I need. I'm just going to crop this down a little bit. And I know rule of thirds, but actually this one looks this kind of symmetrical, so I'm going to go dead center for this one. So we're going to go for that. Now the last thing I will do for an image before I'm ready to send it out for print is I will sharpen it. Let's do that luminosity trick one more time. And again, remember, since I was able to meter, I had a lot of data in this skylight. Since I was able to do that highlights, but the spot meter, since I had so much data, that was what allowed the HDR software to bring this glass way down. In fact, if you look at it closely, there's these spidery cracks in the glass. We're zoomed in way beyond 100% here. Like here's 100%. But you can see even the fine detail in the wood showed up because we metered this highlight spot and it was able to be compressed down into the image. And we have got some weird chromatic stuff going on here in these bars. Actually, that's not a problem because I have another thought what I want to do with this. I want to add some more luminosity to this image, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to stack this. And to stack it, I'm going to hold down Alt or Option and choose Merge Visible. And what stacking does is it gives me a flattened version of the image, but I get to keep all my layers. And there's a couple reasons that I would come across doing that. What I want to do is, again, go to the RGB channels, Command or Control click on the RGB icon. I got my luminous spots. Command J for a new layer. I know I'm doing this fast, but I'm just about out of time, so I want to finish this. Change it to overlay, and ooh, look what that did. I like that. Maybe a little too strong. So let's see what soft light looks like. Oh, that's better. You can see soft light is a less contrasty version than overlay is, and that's looking pretty cool. Last thing I'm going to do is I want this area here, kind of thinking you're entering down this prison here and it's getting creepier. I'm going to black and white the center of this. So I'm going to create a black and white version. And let's take a look and see what infrared does. I'm curious for this one. Yeah, that's kind of creepy. That's what I was after. Also, see the little finger here? I'm going to click on there and bring that down just a smidge. Cool. All right, now I don't want the entire image to be black and white, just some of this middle section. So I'm going to fill the mask with black and put white back in the foreground, get myself a big brush, and I'm going to paint about 40%, and I'm just going to have it start kind of radiating out a little bit into black and white. And I do want this center section to be completely black and white. So as we zoom in, as you start to head down the hallway, you just kind of get this kind of creepy, grainy black and white infrared feeling. Cool, that's what I'm after. Oh, and again, the last thing, somebody wanted to see Topaz. Let's give it a really bit pop. I'm going to stack again, Alt, Merge Visible, and go to my other favorite set of filters, Topaz Adjust, which kind of does HDR work on single images. It's kind of a simulated. And again, Ken asks, are all my images 2 f-stops apart? Again, in this case, yes, they were 2 f-stops apart. And David asked, do I often print large? I always print large. Rarely do I make prints smaller than 16 by 20. Frequently 20 by 30, 24 by 36, and 30 by 40. All right, so this is Topaz, which has a whole bunch of filters here, and as I scroll down, you can kind of get a quick view of them. Photopop is one I use a lot, and you can see as I hold down what it does for the image. Portrait drama, even for landscapes, I will do. Kind of adds a really different effect to it. And the always freaky and over-the-top Spicify, which is really crazy. Now, this looks like way too much, and for this image it is. And yes, you can go through all the settings on the right and turn these down. However, I'm going to leave it and let it run at 100% because since it's on its own layer, and that's what that stacking did for me, created a layer, I can take this composite, I can then just bring the opacity down and it adds that extra grungy effect to the image. You can see you can flavor it to taste at this point. I can bring it down to 20 or 30%, and it just adds a little bit to the image. So the last thing I do for sharpening, my favorite sharpening is Smart Sharpen. And my favorite set of settings for sharpening is what you see right here. 180% at 8/10. Now, this can be a lot for certain kinds of images, but for landscapes and graphical kind of stuff, it works really well for bringing out fine detail. And notice as I push down on the spacebar to turn it off and then let go, look what it does. Look how it brings out that fine detail of this real graphical image. Now, if I was doing this and I had a sky and a landscape, again, since I had my stack on another layer, I would create a mask and then mask out the sky. So I got my sharpness in my mountain faces, but not on the sky because I don't want to add green. So again, that was Topaz. Topaz Adjust. Everybody should have Topaz Adjust. It's amazing what it does to images. Kind of a subject for another day. In a minute, I will give you a discount code that you can use for both Nik Software and Topaz if you're interested. Okay, so let's finish up. We're just about out of time here. Actually, I like how this has turned out, so I'm going to save this. Let me go ahead and save. I'll save it on the desktop and put it away later. And I don't usually save as TIFFs, but just for speed's sake, I'll leave it there. All right. Now I can turn off the rest of the filters so you can see what we ended up with. Kind of pretty cool. And again, the reason I use a meter is I was able to capture everything I needed for this image in those 3 exposures. By having my highlight with the spot meter, I was able to maintain all the detail I needed up in this highlight. My average reading, which again would have been way too light with the camera's meter because the overall scene, gave me a good foundation. And then using the spot meter again for the shadow allowed me to capture the very fine detail in these old door jambs, and again, only needing 3 exposures to do it. Okay, so let's finish up. So I hope you've seen, if you're not using a meter right now, it will really have the greatest effect on the quality of your photography. You just cannot count on your camera's meter for a lot of things. If you're a real experienced photographer, you can pull some of this stuff off by looking with your eye and seeing the scene and say, oh, this is a little bright, this is a little dark. Having a meter takes the guesswork out of it because it can't be fooled. If you already have something like this, this is Sekonic 358. It is an incident meter. It does not do spot readings. You can use the combination of this with your camera spot meter. That will get you pretty close. The beauty of the 758, along with many other things it does, is it's got a 1 degree angle spot meter. So wherever you point it, you're going to get an exact reading. But you can make do with the 358 and your camera spot meter if you already own that. So let's take a look at some before and afters. Again, we saw our hay bales earlier, taking the two, compositing them together. Our scene, and this one I processed a little differently. In fact, I think somebody asked about straightening the image. Would I straighten it? I actually took it the other direction. I bent it. I thought by bending the image, it actually kind of threw off your equilibrium a little more and added even a little more drama to the shot. So again, that's the subjective creative part. This is a scene in an abandoned house. If this scene looks familiar, if any of you guys have seen Rick Samans' HDR book on HDR photography, you might recognize this room. This room with a girl in a gown standing with her back to the camera. This was the same room. We found this place and went and shot, and he came back the next day with his model, and that was the cover for his HDR book. And again, a scene in Bryce Canyon. Same thing. 3 exposures, 2 stops apart. Ends up with a beautiful canyon shot, much closer to what your eyes saw and not having to live with the limitations of the camera. Is it maybe a little super realistic? Yes, it is. But I was after creating a photographic image, not trying to document a scene. I wanted to create something that just really kind of conveyed the beauty of the place, and having the meter was what allowed me to do that. And then lastly, our train car. Again, 3 exposures. I don't think I've ever come across a scene where I've needed more than 3 exposures. So you see, HDR will allow you to take great tonal ranges and compress them down into a single shot. You get rid of the muddy shadows. You have the choice of having your images done very realistically, like this combination right here. And yes, this is Eastern State again. Or you can completely take it super realistic or graphical and create a completely different mood. And think of it as flavoring. You do it to your likes. So we're completely out of time. I thank you all for spending time with me today. I mentioned a discount code. Unfortunately, I don't think this one works with Photomatix. I have to talk to them. But if you use J. Brady in either Nick Software's website, nicksoftware.com, or Topaz at topazlabs.com, it will get you 15% off of any of the Nick softwares and 10% off of any of the Topaz softwares. So if you're not using these, highly recommend it. They're a lot of fun, and they'll do a lot of cool stuff. And again, visit Sekonic's website. Brand new website just launched, beautifully done, lots of great information on it. If you're not using a meter, you really should be. It will really have the greatest effect on the quality of your photography. So that's it for today. Thanks for joining. Thanks for the great questions again. Hope to see you online again soon. Until then, everyone have a great rest of the day, great rest of the week. Bye-bye.